Oh my god, I've been working on this script for so long! What's up, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. I am Shelby Nave, and today we're going to be talking about the history and influence of the Italian-American Mafia. Y'all, I genuinely just had no idea what I was signing up for when I said that I wanted to make a video essay over the mob, because I genuinely just had no idea how vast of a history the mob has and how much they greatly influence some pretty monumental points in American history. Like, I don't think we would have the America that we have today without the influences that the mob inevitably had on it. And not only just that they had influence, but so much influence. In fact, when I started researching for this series that I've been doing over the mob, I ordered a book on Amazon, just to, read and to reference and stuff like that. And do you want to know what came in the mail? Yeah, so there was clearly a lot of material to cover, and hence why this video took me so long to write. That being said, I have a script in front of me. There's gonna be points when I'm probably directly reading off of it. If you see me reading, it's because that's what I'm actually doing. But anyway, in case if you missed it, I did actually already post a video discussing some of America's most notorious mobsters. This video is essentially the counterpart to that one because I will be mentioning, the people in that video in this video. However, I just won't be going super in-depth into like their bios and stuff like that. I just want to tell you that beforehand so you didn't think that I was just like throwing a bunch of names at you without giving you any sort of explanation on who these people are or why they're important. If you want a little more of a deeper dive into the people who made up the mob, I would go check out that video, because today I'm focusing more on the mob as an organization rather than the individual people involved. That being said, the mob is fascinating. And I know I'm not the only one thinking that. I think a lot of people find the mob particularly compelling to learn about just because of its ability to turn criminal operations into a multi-billion-dollar empire. I feel like no matter where your feelings lie regarding the mob, there's no denying that what they were able to build and accomplish and get away with is pretty impressive. I'm not saying it's right, especially since the mob's success is pretty much single-handedly accomplished by preying on the weak, but it is pretty impressive that they were not only able to do it, but get away with it for a pretty long time. The mob has a certain criminal creativity, if you will, that allowed it to kind of adapt and expand over time, and that ultimately kind of caused mob influence on some pretty monumental points in history. But where did it all start? How did the mob come to be this massive presence across America? Let's talk about it. As always, I do my best to fact check myself, but please keep in mind, I am a one-man show over here. I try to be as accurate as possible, and I'm gonna try to do my very best, but if I do say something that you don't agree with, please nicely let me know in the comments below. Now let's get into it. The mob's roots are actually traced all the way back to Sicily, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea between North Africa and the Italian mainland. Up until the mid-19th century, Sicily had been invaded by several different groups, including the Phoenicians, Romans, Arabs, French, and Spanish, which in turn caused many Sicilians to band together to not only protect themselves, but also to carry out their own justices against their intruders. History.com says, in Sicily, the term mafioso, or mafia member, initially had no criminal connotations and was used to refer to a person who was suspicious of central authority. By the 19th century, some of these groups emerged as private armies, or mafi, who extorted protection money from landowners and eventually became the violent criminal organization known today as the Sicilian Mafia. I definitely think it's important to note, just because it's going to continue to get brought up, is that this concept of fighting back from central authority, as the article put it, is something that the mob has kind of held on to and lived by through pretty much the entire duration of its existence. With the Sicilian population getting invaded by different foreign powers, I can imagine why that would force them to A, not trust the people who keep coming in and trying to take over their country, and B, just take matters into their own hands and resort to criminal activity just to keep from getting pushed around. So, at the turn of the century, numerous Italians, along with many other Europeans from other countries, began migrating to the US to not only escape things like wars and oppression, but also in search of new and better opportunities. These immigrants usually could only get the most dangerous and lowest paying jobs. A few of the new arrivals took shortcuts to the American dream, forming street gangs and criminal syndicates, and began engaging in robbery, extortion, counterfeiting, and other illicit schemes. So even though the mob technically established its first US presence in New Orleans, arguably the biggest hub for the mob was in and around New York City, which is where I primarily focused for this video. So mob/gang activity in America, particularly in New York, started heating up in the early 1900s. Not only between Italian gangsters, but also with other groups like the Irish and the Jewish gangs that were also a thing happening there. But a power struggle eventually started breaking out over who would be in charge of the Italian Mafia in America. There were two factions in particular who were involved in the conflict that would become known as the Castellammarese War, and this lasted from 1929 to 1931. The name Castellammarese refers to immigrants who came from the town Castellamare del Golfo. I know that's not right.
Castellamare del Golfo.
Castellamare del Golfo.
Castellamare del Golfo.
You got it, okay? That's where they came from. Immigrants who came from that town in western Sicily, and these members were led by New York gangster Salvatore Maranzano. The other faction consisted of people who originated from other areas of Sicily, but primarily from Naples, and this group was led by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. Masseria's faction consisted of a lot of other really popular mobsters at the time, such as Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia. I touch on all of those guys in detail in my other video if you are curious about their stories and their upbringing and all of that, because this war in particular is significant to all of them. They were on Masseria's side originally, but ended up flipping and supporting Maranzano in the war in the end. I'm pretty sure it was Lucky Luciano even who ordered Costello, Genovese, Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel to carry out the hit on Masseria. So yeah, needless to say, the Castellammarese War was a very bloody power struggle and turf war that did result in Maranzano's victory in 1931. There was a lot that went into the war. There was a lot of murders, a lot of people picking and switching sides. It was a big old bloody mess. But nonetheless, shortly after the war was over, Maranzano established the original 5 New York-based families, and those families were the Maranzano, the Profaci, Mangano, Luciano, and Gagliano families. And I think most mob members actually kind of like this whole restructure of the mob and the families until Maranzano decided to declare himself Capo di Tutti Capi. I don't think that's right.
Capo di Tutti Capi.
Capo di Tutti Capi. That's just what the internet says. Basically, he declared himself the boss of all bosses. And that, in turn, rubbed some people the wrong way. This brings us to Lucky Luciano and his whole crew, who were the younger generation of gangster and perhaps maybe didn't support Maranzano or Masseria. The Mafia Wiki says, outwardly the Castellammarese War was between the forces of Masseria and Maranzano. In reality, it was a generational conflict between the old guard Sicilian leadership, fondly known as the Mustache Petes for their long mustaches and old world ways, and the Young Turks, a younger and more diverse Italian group who wanted to work more with non-Italians. So it seems like the conflict could have started as a battle between Masseria and Maranzano, but it may have ended as a war between the older generation of the mob and the younger generation of the mob, most of whom had actually grown up in the US and were kind of more progressive and forward-thinking in their business practices. The younger generation didn't have a problem doing business with people who weren't of Italian descent, and the older generation did. So many did wonder if Masseria would even be able to effectively lead in a modern era, so I think that's also why a lot of people swapped sides and supported Maranzano. Maranzano was described as being a little more forward-thinking than Masseria, but I think after the fact, Lucky Luciano thought that he was just as, if not more greedy than Masseria was. I mean, he did try to declare himself king boss and got rid of a whole bunch of family rackets in favor of his own, so that's probably not an unusual feeling that other mob members were rubbed the wrong way because of that. After reading about this war, it seemed like Luciano was just kind of going along with things for a while and secretly plotted to remove Maranzano after the fact. Maranzano eventually decided that Luciano was a threat and ordered a hit on him, but Luciano was tipped off by fellow popular mobster Tommy Lucchese that Maranzano was going to try to have him killed, so Luciano decided to act first and had Maranzano assassinated at his office in September of 1931. So, due to Maranzano's assassination, which was a hit carried out by Lucky Luciano and his group, this caused the power to shift into the hands of Luciano, who kept the format of the 5 families that Maranzano had established, but he abolished the whole, boss of all bosses thing and instead established what will be known as the Commission. The Commission is essentially the executive body of the mob that consisted of the bosses of all 5 families who kind of just, like split up and shared the power. The mob essentially now had a governing entity made up of 5 normal bosses rather than just like one giant mega boss. They worked together, they governed together. This in turn decreased bloodshed amongst the families and maximized profits across the families. And I think that this proved to be very beneficial for them because each family had their own rackets and stuff that kind of intertwined with each other. So the Commission was responsible to keep everything running smoothly and organized, if you will. Lucky Luciano was appointed chairman of the Commission, but the other bosses who were involved was Vincent Mangano, Tommy Gagliano, Joseph Bonanno, and Joe Profaci. Technically, the Commission also included Al Capone out of Chicago and Stefano Magaddino from Buffalo, but primarily the Commission was based around the 5 New York families. Like, yeah, we had the little Chicago, the little Buffalo hub, but is mainly New York. Which, by the way, I think it is also kind of interesting to note that most other cities that had a mob presence just had like one family, but since New York is so big and had so many criminal operations going on, they had 5 families there. So now that we've established what the Commission actually is, let's talk about the actual families and the bosses who govern these families. While researching for this video, one of the things that I found just particularly challenging was not only keeping track of like which people belong to which family, but also keeping straight all of the family names themselves. Obviously, as the families evolved through the years and bosses got replaced with other bosses, many family names changed with a new boss. So I'm going to be giving you guys the names of the family from when they were first established, and then also the names of what they go by now and what they will be during the rest of the story of the mob that we're gonna go through. I think that will be a little helpful in keeping things straight. So first up, we have the Maranzano family, named after Salvatore Maranzano. It is now known as the Bonanno family, named after Joe Bonanno. Then we have the Profaci family, named after Joe Profaci. It's now known as the Colombo family, named after Joseph Colombo. The Luciano family, named after Lucky Luciano, the guy who established the Commission, is now the Genovese family, named after Vito Genovese. The Gagliano family, named after Tommy Gagliano, is now known as the Lucchese family, named after Tommy Lucchese. And lastly, the Mangano family, named after Vincent Mangano, is now the Gambino family, named after Carlo Gambino. So now, before we go into more of the history of the mob and all of the things that they did and accomplished as an organization, let's talk about some of the fundamental principles of the mob. Like, what did it actually mean to be a part of an organized crime family? Because Lord knows not just anybody was allowed to join, and you kind of had to earn it in a way. Over the course of more than a century, the mob gained success and power through 3 main ways: violence, fear, and secrecy. Violence, or fear of violence, was a very effective tool for the mob in order to get what they wanted. Secrecy kept them from getting caught. The mob had no issues using violence to take out their enemies or even former mob members who had become informants. Given the nature of the mob, secrecy was absolutely essential for operating undetected. Likewise, fear was pretty major too, because if you scare somebody bad enough, odds are they're gonna do what you want them to. Competitors need to fear you so they don't try to cross you, and then workers need to fear you so they don't try to steal from you or rat on you. This in turn establishes respect. That being said, when new members join the mob, they have to take the oath of omertà in order to become what is referred to as a made man. All made members were officially a part of the organization, and that came with responsibilities. Originating in Sicily, the code of omertà essentially means death before dishonor. It's a code of silence and also a code of loyalty. An honorable man doesn't talk and doesn't go to the law. And to my understanding, after taking this oath, the mob essentially becomes the most important thing in your life. It comes before anything else. Because if you think about it, if you're joining the mob, you're essentially joining a secret society, which came with a lot of risk, but also came with a lot of respect, power, money, and a sense of honor. One interview I watched said that many guys loved that life, they were devoted to it, and they were willing to die for it. But taking an oath like this also meant that if you broke it or turned against the mob, that's an offense that's punishable by death, meaning that they will quite literally kill you on the spot, no questions asked, punishment if you break the code. Weirdly, I feel like having an oath like this is one of the main reasons why the mob has been able to go on as long as it has, and also remain undetected for so long, because I feel like the consequence of death probably keeps a lot of people silent and, you know, like in line, keeps them quiet, keeps them loyal. I mentioned this briefly as well in my last video that most people didn't really have any sort of knowledge of the mob until a former member named Joe Valachi became a government informant. Like, that was a really big deal when he became an informant because he was the first made man to like break the code and speak to government. So yeah, long story short, if you're gonna be in the mob, it's pretty much expected of you to remain tight-lipped and deny any sort of accusation that comes your way. So now let's talk about the hierarchy of the mob, or the levels of rank, if you will. If you've seen literally any mob movie, you've probably heard the leaders of the families referred to as the boss, and that's what they are. The boss, or the Don, is at the top of the hierarchy and is the undisputed leader of the entire organization or family, meaning basically whatever they say goes and no questions asked. They are obviously in charge of and responsible for the rackets and operations occurring within their family. Next is the underboss. This position is the boss's second in command and would ultimately take over the family if the boss either steps down or is more likely killed or put in jail. A lot of times this position is a family member or son of the boss who is being groomed to eventually take over the business, but other times it's just like a close friend of the boss or a mentee. So taking a step down, or sideways rather, is the position known as the consigliere. I don't know if I'm saying this word right. I've heard some people say it's consigliere, some people just like leave out the G and say consigliere. This person is often a confidant, or again a very close friend of the boss, whose purpose is to provide advice or counsel regarding mob operations to the boss. Going down another step, the next position is the capo regimes, or capos, or captains. They're essentially street bosses. They're the lowest level leadership position. The capos are ranking made members who typically run and lead a crew of soldiers. You know, that's pretty similar in terms and positions used in the military. Then we have the soldiers. These are the lowest ranking members of the family, but are still very much respected because they are still made men. They are often the ones carrying out the actual day-to-day tasks and orders given to them by their boss. Lastly, at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have the associates. The associates are not made men, so they're not like official members of the organization, but they still have relations and commit crimes with or under the direction of made members. Associates are also allowed to be of any ethnicity because they're not like fully involved. However, if an associate is not Italian, then they can't advance further into the organization or move up any ranks. You had to be Italian to join the mob, or at least you did at the time. I think nowadays it's a little more lenient. Like, I think it's just like your father had to be Italian. Like, I don't know if you necessarily have to be full-blood Italian anymore to join. But anyway, associates worked with and for the mob, but weren't actually a part of the mob. Alright, I think it's time to get into the meat and potatoes of this video. Let's talk about the business of the mob and the money-making machine that it would inevitably become. So the Mafia has been functioning and operating numerous business and rackets in the United States easily for the last 100 years. However, based on my research and the sources that I looked into, it seems like there were three very significant booms in mob business. One being the 20s and 30s during the Prohibition era, the next during the 40s and 50s and the Vegas era when all of that was just starting to take off out there, and lastly during the 70s and 80s during the major construction era in New York City. Before I go into detail about these three eras, I feel like it's important to remember that the Mafia wasn't involved in just one industry or one type of business, but rather they were involved in nearly everything, honestly. If something was making money, they found a way into it. I think this became more so in the later eras, but like, do not be fooled. The mob didn't only dominate outlaw business, but they had their hands tangled up in a whole bunch of legitimate businesses as well. Like, they pretty much owned New York, among other cities, for a pretty long time. We'll start with the Prohibition era businesses. Arguably, maybe the most popular mob business, at least the most known. On January 17th, 1920, the US's 18th Amendment came into effect, which banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Needless to say, the alcohol industry was huge, as it still is today, and a ban like this made a massive business opportunity for the mob: bootlegging. You ever wonder how speakeasies became a thing? Well, the mob needed secret locations to sell and distribute the illegal alcohol that they had smuggled into the US from other countries, and the people loved it! The thing that made bootlegging such a genius business venture for the mob specifically was the fact that these gangsters, who already had no issues breaking the law, were now able to essentially take over an entire industry that still had a huge demand, and they profited so heavily off of that. Most Americans did not think that alcohol should have been banned in the first place, so they would kind of like turn a blind eye to the mob selling alcohol and maybe other sketchy things that they were up to in order to, you know, keep the alcohol flowing and the cocktails coming. So not only did the mob make just outrageous amounts of money through bootlegging, but it also really enhanced their reputation with the public. I think in many ways the mob kind of had an almost like vigilante persona, because they were essentially, you know, giving the people what they wanted. Maybe vigilante isn't the right word, but more so like an anti-hero. You know, they were anti-establishment, anti-central authority, kind of like fighters for the people, if you will. But I think for a lot of people, they were under the impression that like mobsters only hurt other mobsters, or, you know, they only did bad things to other mobsters, plus they're giving us alcohol. So I think a lot more people were willing to just kind of like tolerate anything that the mob was up to because everybody wanted that sweet, sweet alcohol. However, even though the mob's act of bootlegging brought alcohol into the hands of the general public again, it came with some consequences. There were numerous instances reported in the Prohibition area of people dying from contaminated alcohol. Some of these contaminations possibly coming from the US government themselves? History.com says, enterprising bootleggers produced millions of gallons of bathtub gin, a rot gut moonshine during Prohibition. This illicit hooch had a famously foul taste, and those desperate enough to drink it also ran the risk of being struck blind or even poisoned. The most deadly tinctures contained industrial alcohol originally made for use in fuels and medical supplies. The federal government had required companies to denature industrial alcohol and make it undrinkable as early as 1906, but during Prohibition, it ordered them to add quinine, methyl alcohol, and other toxic chemicals as a further deterrent. Coupled with other low-quality products on offer from bootleggers, this tainted booze may have killed more than 10,000 people before the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So, yeah, people quite literally paying to poison themselves. Nonetheless, the mob made a buttload of money during Prohibition. The 18th Amendment was appealed in 1933, so when the bootlegging business started to simmer out, the mob of course had to expand and move into other business opportunities, and this brings us to our next boom, if you will, which is the development of Las Vegas. There's no denying that the mob had its grip on Las Vegas from the very beginning and helped define its nickname of Sin City. Honestly, Las Vegas wasn't Las Vegas until the mob got there. Not only did the mob have the flamingo that Mayor Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were in charge of overseeing, something I talk about more in depth in my other video. Also, quick side note, if you do go over and watch my other video, I realized that I had said Bugsy Siegel's name wrong the entire time. For some reason, I thought that his name was Seagal. It was pronounced Bugsy Seagal, but it's not. It's pronounced the way that it's spelled, which is Siegel. Yeah, I showed that video to my mom, and she was like, you know it's Bugsy Siegel, right? And I was like, way to go, me. I just said it wrong the entire time. So yeah, it's Bugsy Siegel is all I was trying to say. But there were a whole bunch of other mob-connected casinos other than the Flamingo that popped up in Las Vegas, including the Sands, Dunes, Riviera, Tropicana, and Stardust. Obviously, this majorly enhanced the mob's gambling rackets and also encouraged other sinful rackets, if you will, including prostitution and drug rackets, even though the drug business was strictly prohibited by many mob bosses. Several of these hotels/casinos were financed, or refinanced rather, by the mob-dominated Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, led by company president Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was not a part of the mob, however he had really close relations with the mob, and he is a particularly curious character in the story of the Mafia because Jimmy Hoffa has actually been missing since 1975. I don't know why I just laughed, it's not funny. It's a pretty notorious mob-related disappearance that has never been solved. It's said that Hoffa was in the midst of a turf battle with some rivals in Detroit, and that caused him to seek out help from the mob. Hoffa hired the mob to get rid of his rivals, which they they did. They took care of it. However, now Hoffa found himself indebted to the mob, and like everything else, they owned him. I imagine most people already know this, but in case if you don't, if you go to the mob with the intention of seeking out their help for doing something illegal usually, or you want them to take care of something for you, it's not like paying a TaskRabbit to come over to your house and hang your TV and then you never hear from them again. That's not how it works. I am going to link a BuzzFeed Unsolved video in the description that I thought did a really good job discussing the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa and really kind of fleshed out the whole story of how he even got tangled up in the mob in the first place. Jimmy Hoffa being known for having mob connections while also holding a high position in labor unions drew scrutiny not only from law enforcement and lawmakers, but also drew the attention of none other than Robert Kennedy.
What has violence ever accomplished? What has it ever created? No martyr's cause has ever been stilled by an assassin's bullet. No wrongs have ever been righted by riots and civil disorders. A sniper is only a coward, not a hero. And an uncontrolled or uncontrollable mob is only the voice of madness, not the voice of the people. Among free men, said Abraham Lincoln, there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. And those who take such appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost. Violence breeds violence. Repression breeds retaliation. And only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls.
It definitely seemed to be very important to Bobby Kennedy to take down the mob and to rid them from not only Las Vegas but everywhere. Bobby Kennedy faced off with numerous mobsters and mob associates, including Jimmy Hoffa, in court attempting to get them put away or deported. When Bobby Kennedy became Attorney General, he really started to campaign against the mob, and one documentary that I watched said that the face-off between Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa was like two boys in a schoolyard with how they just argued back and forth with each other. This had to have been very frustrating for Bobby Kennedy, particularly because from what I read and watched, it wasn't super easy to get these guys behind bars. Like, the mob bought everything. The police, the courts, the politicians, the judges, and on and on and on. The mob had a lot of influence, connections, and useful people in their pockets that made convicting them very difficult. Bobby Kennedy did end up getting Jimmy Hoffa convicted for jury tampering and also got New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello deported back to Guatemala, which really pissed him off, and he eventually snuck back into the US with a massive hatred of Bobby Kennedy. Then sadly, on June 6, 1968, Bobby Kennedy was in LA seeking his party's presidential nomination when he was shot and killed. Some people believe that Bobby Kennedy's assassination was a mob hit as retaliation of years of prosecuting mob members. But nonetheless, the mob dominated Las Vegas until the 1960s when a man named Howard Hughes started purchasing numerous casinos in Las Vegas, which in turn resulted in the offset of mob influence and control in Las Vegas. From that point on, the mob kind of started to fizzle out of Vegas. It became a lot harder for them to do business there. Another quick side note though, I briefly want to step away from the business of the mob just for a second, just because since we've been talking about Bobby Kennedy and him dealing with the mob and stuff, I also wanted to discuss some interesting things I found out regarding John F. Kennedy and the mob, and I didn't really know where else to squeeze this into the video, so we're gonna take a quick little side tangent. Let's talk about the JFK assassination potentially being a mob hit real fast. I mean, this really could be a whole video in itself, but I at least wanted to briefly kind of touch on the fact that there are numerous theories that the JFK assassination could have been a mob hit. And if you guys are curious, there is a YouTube channel here on YouTube of a former mob member. His name is Michael Francis. He's a former capo of the Colombo family. I bought his book as well. Michael Francis has a channel here on YouTube, and if you have any interest in the mob whatsoever, you should really check it out because it's a whole different perspective learning about the mob from somebody who was actually in it. And he obviously has a whole bunch of like interesting stories and opinions regarding the mob, and the reason I bring this up is because he totally thinks that the JFK assassination was a mob hit. Here's a video of Michael Francis talking about it in an interview with Vlad TV.
Now, you believe that the Mafia has something to do with JFK's murder?
Yeah, I believe that firmly because of what I was told, and there's no reason for people to mislead or lie to me. People, as part of that life, that had knowledge. From what I was told, it makes sense to me that there was a deal struck with the White House through Joe Kennedy, and it was violated, and people on the street were very upset about it.
Okay, Joe Kennedy was the father.
Yeah.
Who was in the bootlegging business, the liquor bootlegging business.
Correct. Yeah, and at one point in time, they wanted to kill Joe Kennedy because he was either double dealing or not doing right on the street. And Bobby Kennedy went even further. I mean, he started prosecuting the mob.
Okay, and you think because of that, they actually put together a hit on John F. Kennedy?
Yeah.
You think the Italian Mafia worked with Lee Harvey Oswald to kill Kennedy?
Yeah, now I don't know if they directly worked with Oswald. I mean, Jack Ruby, you know, was certainly associated with us.
Right.
All these documents that are under seal that would never been released. The government is never going to want to admit to the fact that the mob had a hit on the President of the United States and was able to carry it out, because that just doesn't look good for them.
Okay, and Jack Ruby was a mob guy?
He was associated, yeah.
Associated.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Wait, what? Jack Ruby, who was the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald while Oswald was in police custody, is an associate of the mob? Lee Harvey Oswald may have also been an associate of the mob? I don't know, guys. This has fishy written all over it for me. And I mean, this is coming from a guy who is actually a part of the organization, so for me personally, I'm inclined to believe him and think he's actually onto something. And I mean, he heard this from his dad, who was actively involved during this time period, so I personally don't see why he would like lie about that, unless if the information was just wrong and it was wrong when his dad told him, whatever. I'm also very much inclined to agree with him that the US would never want the public to find out that the president may have been on the mob's hit list and was actually taken out. I also agree with him because I 1000% believe, and we've talked about this on other videos on my channel before, that the US has been involved in numerous conspiracies and attempted to cover them up. I made 2 videos already over the My Lai massacre, which was an event that happened during the Vietnam War. It's an incident where the US blatantly tried to cover up America's involvement in the massacre. The Watergate scandal is another example. I don't have a video on it, but it was a very popular scandal when the actual President of the United States, Richard Nixon, and his team were committing crimes to cheat and manipulate the election and took vast steps to cover it up. Those are just 2 examples in this general time period of people in power in the United States government lying to the American public. Why would they not lie about the JFK assassination if something went on that they didn't want the public to know about? And more specifically, why would they not lie about people in the US government having some sort of relationship with the mob? According to many articles that I read on history.com, it really does seem like the majority of the public believes that there had to have been some sort of conspiracy having to do with the JFK assassination. Most people don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And there's obviously many other theories of who could have been involved, who could have done it, and why. The mob isn't the only theory out there. But if there is one thing that I've learned during all of this research for these few videos that I've been making, is that you should never underestimate the power of the mob. Of course, I can't prove any theory one way or another, but I just truly believe that if the mob did want to take out the president for some reason, they'd probably find a way. I don't know. Anyway though, Kennedy tangent is over. Let's get back to the business of the mob. So during the 70s and 80s, any ideas what New York City was doing a lot of? Making buildings. And of course, the mob was all up in that. Concrete and construction in New York City especially was huge during this time. Literally. This time period is often referred to as the golden era of the mob. We mentioned earlier how the mob had their hands tangled up in all sorts of businesses, including labor unions. If you wanted to build something or have pretty much any sort of major construction project in the city, you kind of had to go through the mob. You may be asking right now, how? How did the mob get into a position where they have so much control and influence over the construction industry? This brings us to a man named Ralph Scopo. I think that's how you pronounce it. Scapo. It might be Scapo. I should look it up.
pronouncenames.com.
I really should just subscribe to this channel by now.
Scopo.
Scapo. Okay, so this brings us to a man named Ralph Scapo. He was a member of the Colombo family and just so happened to be the president of the Cement and Concrete Workers Union. Convenient. And this is basically where the mob got their into the industry. Scapo used his position to extort money from cement contractors in New York in return for large construction contracts and labor peace. Contracts between $2 million and $15 million were reserved for a club of contractors called the Concrete Club, which were selected by the commission. In return, the contractors gave a 2% kickback of the contract value to the commission. Although Scapo was a low-ranking soldier, his membership in the Concrete Club allowed him more influence than some capos of the Colombo family. The Concrete Club that I just mentioned had 8 different companies that participated, all of which were connected to the mob in some way. I mean, pretty much everything was fixed, and any construction job over $2 million in value would have to pay the mob a cut of the project. A quote from a documentary I watched said that the Concrete Club had to have been one of the most audacious schemes that the mob had ever pulled off. So yeah, needless to say, the construction industry was probably the most profitable racket for the mob at the time, but I think it's also important to note that it wasn't just the construction industry that boomed in the 70s and 80s. The mob was involved in virtually everything at this time. To just give you an idea, they had their hands in unions, bankers, insurance companies, fish markets, the gasoline industry, the garment industry, the garbage and sanitation industry, product transportation, restaurant industry, healthcare, ships, docks. They controlled all that. From what I read, at this point in time, the mob was essentially untouchable because they were everywhere running everything. However, the 80s also brought new challenges to the mob that would eventually lead to their demise, and it actually came from the other side of the law. The FBI had finally gained an upper hand over the mob for the first time in literal years by the use of RICO, the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO essentially allowed the federal government to prosecute mob bosses, aka those who are actually calling the shots, and not just the ground soldiers who are carrying out the orders. This act was huge for law enforcement because obviously the biggest targets in the mob are the bosses, and they often aren't the ones that are actually carrying out the crimes that are being committed. It's the people who are working for them. And the thing is too about the mobs, like, yeah, law enforcement could arrest a soldier, but that soldier will just be immediately replaced. Even like capos and maybe even underbosses, you can arrest them, but then they're just immediately replaced. Like, it really doesn't stop or affect the criminal enterprise at all, because it's just there's always a new guy to take the place of whatever lower level person the police would arrest. So now they wanted to go after the top dogs. They want to go after the bosses. RICO made it so that everybody who was a part of the criminal organization, including those who are just calling the shots, could be taken down and arrested collectively. It tied the foot soldiers to the shot callers, essentially. Honestly, it was particularly interesting reading about the RICO Act and how long it took for law enforcement to gain any sort of advantage over the mob just because they were so powerful at that time. In 1980s New York, the police could barely get anybody associated with the mob arrested. Not to mention the FBI at the time were very, not in sync with each other when it came to how they were actually investigating and going after the mob. The FBI had like 3 different offices who each took a different approach at investigating and going after them. So we have several very unorganized investigations trying to go after an empire of highly organized crime. You see the problem. Most citizens at this time did not believe that the police could stop the mob. So, in 1970, the RICO Act was written and put into action to aid in bringing large criminal organizations to justice. And yes, you heard that right. The RICO Act was written in 1970, and all of this is happening in the 1980s. Meaning the RICO Act had been around for a good 10 years before the FBI knew how to utilize it. Honestly, I find that just very comical. Police and the FBI were probably just kicking themselves that they had a tool as powerful as RICO in their possession for the past decade, just none of them knew how to use it. One documentary I watched stated how many law enforcement people had to go to like a seminar or something where the writer of the act actually explained the act and like explained how it worked and such. So now, in the 1980s, 10 years after its creation, the FBI is was using RICO to take down the mob. And a person who was a major driving force for using RICO to take down the mob was Rudolph Giuliani. Giuliani was a US attorney in New York and a very prestigious prosecutor. Being of Italian descent as well, he actually hated the mob and what the mob did to people and small business owners who were just trying to, run their businesses and attempt the American dream until the mob would come in and demand a chunk of their profits, and if they said no, then mobsters would threaten to hurt them or destroy their businesses. So Rudy Giuliani was not a fan of that. He wasn't a fan of the mob, and he was determined to use RICO to go after the mob bosses and collapse the hierarchy. The thing about RICO, though, is that it is a very powerful tool. However, it's absolutely useless without evidence. So naturally, the commission case was born. The commission case, which was led by Rudy Giuliani, was pretty much the biggest organized crime investigation ever up until that point. It was the goal of the FBI to go after the bosses of each family. Therefore, the FBI had each of their different offices focus in on just one family. The objective was to get enough evidence that not only linked the families together as one giant criminal enterprise, but also get enough to make charges stick to all 5 bosses. Obviously, it was a little difficult for the FBI to really find any cooperating witnesses, so they had to get a little more creative. And by that, I mean they started wiretapping places that the mob bosses hung out. Netflix actually has a docu-series called Fear City that goes really in depth on how the FBI was actually able to plant these wiretaps, because it honestly was quite the task for them to do. The mob is very secretive and very private. It's not like the FBI could just walk into a mob hangout and plant bugs everywhere. And not only did the FBI have to figure out where all the popular mob hangouts were, but they also really needed to figure out how they were going to physically get in there and plant a bug without the mob catching on. Because the mob was very aware that the FBI was around and trying to catch them with some dirty hands, so they were also very careful. Anyway, I would really go check out that series if you're interested. It's only 3 episodes, but it really paints the picture of how the FBI pulled off getting into these places, planting bugs, gathering all the evidence that did eventually take down these 5 bosses. And it was some really high-risk situations, and the FBI did get pretty creative and clever of how they pulled it off. So yeah, if you want a little bit more of an in-depth look in the whole wiretapping situation, I would go check that series out. I mean, we're still going to talk about it a little bit briefly here, but if you want in-depth, you should go check out that series. One of the biggest targets for the FBI was Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family. The Gambino family was one of the largest families. The FBI really wanted to wiretap Castellano's house because that's where he spent the majority of his time, and he would host mob meetings there and stuff. However, the FBI didn't have authorization to just bug Castellano's Staten Island mansion yet. What they did have, though, was several informants who, with their testimonies, the FBI gained permission to wiretap Angelo Quack Ruggiero's house and phones. Angelo Ruggiero was a longtime friend of John Gotti, actually. He was a big heroin dealer known for being particularly hostile, unpredictable, and talkative. He received his nickname Quack because he couldn't, keep his quacker from quacking, I guess. Which is pretty funny because it was his big mouth that eventually, led to the demise. Anyway, informants told the FBI that he was kind of the blabbermouth, the weak link, so with that information, they were able to get a court order to tap his phones. So not only did the FBI overhear him heavily shit-talking the boss, Paul Castellano, big oops, but he also revealed the mob's involvement in numerous crimes and outlaw operations, including the drug trafficking that he and the rest of John Gotti's group weren't supposed to be getting involved in. Bigger oops. I said this in my last video, but I'm gonna say it again because it seemed to be highly stressed. The drug business was a big no-no for everyone. Carlo Gambino, who was the boss before Paul Castellano became the boss, infiltrated a deal and die policy amongst the mob, which Castellano also brought over into his reign as boss. And John Gotti knew that if Paul Castellano ever heard Quack's tapes captured by the wiretapping, that Castellano would have him, Ruggiero, and probably anyone else involved killed on the spot. So the conversations captured on Quack's wiretaps provided enough evidence for the FBI to gain a warrant to bug Castellano's house. This is where they heard the good stuff and captured the evidence that revealed the mob's control over labor unions, insurance companies, etc. And then the FBI used similar tactics to get bugs into the hangouts of the all other family bosses as well. They tapped a restaurant where the Colombo crew frequently hung out and caught acting boss Gennaro Langella. They tapped the Lucchese family Tony Duck's Carrillo's car, which is where he typically did meetings and had like hush-hush conversations. They even got wires into the Genovese family Fat Tony Salerno's social club, where the FBI caught a conversation between Tony Ducks and Fat Tony, where they essentially confirmed the existence of the commission. The docuseries didn't really talk about any wiretaps on the Bonanno family, however they were able to tie the murder of Carmen Galante to the commission as evidence, because Galante was the boss of the Bonanno family, and the FBI knew that in order to kill or take out a boss, all of the other bosses had to agree upon it. And then the FBI discovered that Galante was actually shot by a Bonanno soldier who was promoted shortly after the fact, so it was likely a commission-ordered hit. So eventually the FBI had enough evidence to prosecute the bosses of all 5 families, and funny enough, the media almost blew it. Apparently somebody tipped off NBC News that the FBI was about to arrest all of the mob bosses, and they decided that they were going to run that story on the evening news on the eve of when the FBI was going to bust all of the bosses. First of all, I don't know how they were able to just like do that. I don't know how they were able to run a story that would have literally ruined an FBI investigation, because the bust hadn't happened yet. But naturally then the FBI had to act a lot sooner and bust everybody right then, before the evening news happened. So this whole thing, what became known as the Godfather Roundup, happened on the night of February 24th, 1985. So yeah, that was a huge day for the FBI. And I talked about this a lot in my last video in the sections about Paul Castellano and John Gotti, but I feel like I should mention it again because it's significant. But Paul Castellano was actually able to post bail for $3 million after his arrest in the roundup. However, his freedom would not last long, as he was eventually taken out in a very public and famous hit in front of the Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, which was a hit ordered by none other than John Gotti. Like I said, Gotti didn't want Castellano to find out about Quack Quack's tapes, and also his involvement in the drug business, and also he just like hated Paul Castellano and wanted to be boss, so he had Paul Castellano shot to death in front of a restaurant. History.com says, behind closed doors, Gotti was a ruthless, controlling figure whose ability to elude conviction earned him his reputation as the Teflon Don. Publicly, he became a tabloid celebrity, famous for his swagger and expensive suits, which earned him another nickname, the Dapper Don. Despite dodging numerous conviction attempts, John Gotti's luck would eventually run out, and he was arrested in 1990 along with his right hand, Sammy the Bull Gravano, who eventually turned on Gotti and became a government informant, and hence Gotti was determined guilty on all charges, including the murder of Castellano, sent to prison, where he died in prison. So from what I read, after the 1985 Godfather Roundup and the end of John Gotti's reign, the mob no longer seemed to possess the same amount of power as it once had during the golden eras. Not to mention in 2011, the mob took another massive blow when the FBI raided and arrested 127 suspected mobsters all throughout the Northeast area. An article from CBS News stated, the FBI said most of the arrests were made in pre-dawn raids Thursday. Many were in Brooklyn, but they occurred throughout New York City, in New Jersey, and New England. Charges include murder, extortion, and narcotics trafficking. Law enforcement officials tell CBS News that this is considered the largest one-day mob roundup in U.S. history. A total of 127 suspected mobsters are charged, including members of all of the 5 New York crime families that make up La Cosa Nostra. So yeah, it seems after nearly a century of the mob being several steps ahead of law enforcement, the FBI has finally gained an upper hand and taken many steps to take down the organization, but that absolutely does not mean that the mob is dead. It's still very much around and has likely adapted and transitioned into new types of crime and rackets. I mean, the mob evolves with technology just as much as law enforcement does. Not to mention, I'm sure that now in the current day and age, the mob has expanded into other gangs that consist of people of all sorts of ethnicities and backgrounds. So is the mob dead? Honestly, I don't think the empire of organized crime will ever be dead, because like I said in the beginning, the mob has a certain criminal creativity to it that I think will allow it to continue and evolve into modern times. And that's actually all I got. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and going through kind of the history and the influence of the mob with me. This has been by far the most research that I've ever put into one of my videos before. So if you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up and maybe subscribe and come back for more. Now that these 2 video essays are finally complete, it is time for some mob movie commentaries. Those are what is going to be coming next from me. I am so excited to watch some mob movies because I really haven't seen any of them, and now I feel like I have a pretty good knowledge of the mob, so I'm ready to just see it come to the big screen. So mob movie commentaries, those are what is going to be coming up next. I may have other smaller, less information heavy mob videos that kind of are just more discussion-y coming up. I haven't fully decided yet, but absolutely for mob movie commentary. So stick around, please subscribe, thumbs up if you like it. If you guys would like to hang out with me in between uploads, please check the description bar. I've linked all of my social media there. You can go give me a follow if you want. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you the next time I upload a new video.